and then buildings start exploding. First, the Crunch Gym, seconds later, the Gap, and immediately after that, the Starbucks evaporate, and then finally, the McDonald's. Each one of the 4 separate explosions generates a giant cumulus cloud of roaring flame and smoke that rises up into the gray sky, and since the carefully planted bombs have caused the buildings to burst apart outward onto the walkways, bodies either disappear into the flames or fly across the street as if on strings. Their flight interrupted by their smashing into parked BMWs, and umbrellas knocked out of hand are lifted up by the explosions, some on fire, swinging across the gray sky before landing gently on piles of rubble. Alarms are going off in every direction, and the sky is lit up orange, colored by 2 small subsequent explosions, the ground continually vibrating, hidden people yelling out commands, then, at last, silence. But only maybe for 15 seconds before people start screaming. The group of teenagers incinerated. The businessman blown in half by the Starbucks explosion. There is no sign of the Japanese tourist, except for the camcorder, which is in pristine condition. The guy on the motorbike waiting at the spotlight, a charred skeleton hopelessly tangled in the wreckage of the motorbike, which he is now melded into. The fairly mod nanny is dead, and the designer baby carriage she was wheeling looks like it's smashed flat by some kind of giant hand. The black lab has survived, but the Bono lookalike isn't around. His hand blown off at the wrist still clutches the leash, and the dog, covered in ashes and gore, freaked out, dashes madly toward the camera its trainer is standing behind. And on the streets in Notting Hill, a dazed Jamie Fields falls slowly to her knees while gazing up at the gray sky and bows her head guiltily, convulsing in horror and pain as a strange wind blows smoke away, revealing more rubble, more body parts, bathroom products from the Gap, hundreds of blackened plastic Starbucks cups, melted Crunch Gym membership cards, even fitness equipment, Stairmasters, rowing machines, a stationary bike, all smoldering. The initial damage behind Jamie Fields seems terrible, but after a certain amount of time has passed, the street really doesn't look destroyed, just sort of vaguely wrecked. Only 2 BMWs have toppled over, corpses hanging out of the shattered windshields, and where mangled bodies lie, the gore surrounding them looks inauthentic, as if someone had dumped barrels containing smashed tomatoes across the sidewalk, splattered the mixture on top of the body parts and mannequins still standing behind decimated storefront windows, the blood and flesh of the art students, and it just seems too red. But later I'll find out that this particular color looks more real than I could have imagined standing on the streets of Notting Hill. If you're looking at Jamie Fields right now, you'll notice that she's laughing as if relieved, even though she's surrounded by disconnected heads and arms and legs, but these body parts are made of foam, and soon crew members are picking them up effortlessly. A director has already yelled, "Cut," and someone is wrapping a blanket around Jamie and whispering something soothing in her ear. But Jamie seems okay, and as she bows, the sound of applause takes over, raising up to dominate the scene that played itself out in the streets in Notting Hill on this Wednesday morning. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, robot, reader, writer, and that was an excerpt from Bret Easton Ellis's novel Glamorama. Now, why did I start this video out by reading that fabulous book? Now, number one, it is one of my favorite books, and Bret Easton Ellis is one of my favorite authors. I would even call him an influence on my work now. But the point is, the reason that we started out with that is, today we're going to be talking about unreliable narrators, and Victor, who is the point of view character for Glamorama, is in fact an unreliable character. So this is going to contain spoilers for the book Glamorama, so if you don't want to hear those, maybe skip forward a little bit, because I'm not going to talk too much about Glamorama, but I'm going to give an example. The main character and narrator of Glamorama is Victor. He is a metropolis socialite, and the plot behind the story is that he's shooting a reality show. He's traveling around shooting a reality show. When all of this stuff happens, like the explosion, but it's all part of this reality show. Now, here's where the spoiler comes in. He's not actually on a reality show. He is a socialite who has gotten mixed up in international espionage, and his own mental distancing from the trauma that's happening sort of filters the the spy stuff and the violence through this filter of it's a TV show and it's all fake. There's later a part where they are dismembering and torturing a person in the basement. By them, I mean the actual international spies. And he's sharing an apartment with these people, and he just thinks that they're co-stars. And he comes across them torturing this person, and he just recognizes the tortured person as a mannequin, bleeding fake stuff, and just sort of checks out. And so that is how he is an unreliable narrator, is we're viewing this through his own naivety and his own mental rejection of what is happening. And through hints that are dropped throughout the story, we have to pick up what is actually going on in the storyline and what is happening to Victor. So that is our first introduction into what is an unreliable character. Let's go through what exactly is the definition of an unreliable character, what types of unreliable characters are there, because there are a handful of types, and how can you take advantage or maybe apply the unreliable character in your short story or novel. So first off, an unreliable narrator is a narrator who can be defined as someone who misleads readers either deliberately or unwittingly. So they don't have to be completely oblivious to what is going on or naive to what is going on like Victor is. They can do it on purpose. This often happens in mystery novels or thriller novels if you end up being in the bad guy's perspective or an omni or unnamed narrator perspective that can see who is the bad guy, but they don't want to just tell you exactly who is the bad guy. So yeah, you can have them either knowing and deliberate or undeliberate and naive. Many are unreliable through circumstances, character flaws, or psychological difficulties, such as in Victor's case. In some cases, a narrator withholds key information from the readers and they may deliberately lie or misdirect. And I think, in my opinion, that is likely the hardest version. And that might just be my skill and my skill and my experience in which ones to write. Because if you do lie to the reader deliberately, and if they feel tricked purposefully, and not like they were given a chance to solve the mystery, it can feel cheap and actually make your readers angry. An unreliable narrator can be used in first person or third person, close/limited. Usually, most often it is used in first person, but in cases such as Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, it can be used from the third person, unnamed perspective that is giving you insight into all of these different people. And again, that's in a mystery setting so that it gives the reader a sense to see what all is going on in an ensemble piece, in a mystery piece, and to sort of catch clues and worries about who the killer might be without revealing who the killer might be. The advantages to using an unreliable narrator allow that you can work in twists and craziness that are surprising and interesting and that are in a way predictable while also not being predictable. So in one way, I constantly like to mention The Sixth Sense as a good example of a plot twist and an unreliable narrator that is also very obvious in it. So again, another spoiler alert in case you haven't seen The Sixth Sense, but the way that it is shown, the twist, is the character is there the whole time, the adult ghost character. However, the thing that gives him away as being a ghost is that nobody in the scenes with him ever actually acknowledges him. They're only ever actually acknowledging the boy. So then when he's revealed as a ghost at the end, you can go back and see him, how he interacted with, or rather lack of interacting, with people in the previous scenes, to go, oh my gosh, there it was. The reason why the audience accepts it is because those hints are dropped throughout the storyline. Another way that the unreliable narrator another effect of the unreliable narrator is that, so when a story is told, the reader usually can't help with connecting with or being on the side of the storyteller, even if the storyteller is not necessarily a great person. If you think of Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, not a great guy. Also a understatement. Also an unreliable narrator, and it's because that he's an unreliable narrator that you can kind of get into what he's doing and not just see it as blatant brutality. I mean, some people still see it as blatant brutality, but it's easier to get into because it's not so straightforward and he is unreliable. And then in turn, an unreliable narrator can then make complex and conflicted feelings when readers realize that they've been double-crossed by somebody that they have trusted. So again, if you think of Victor in his story, when suddenly we see what is going on, and especially in that case when he is a naive or an unknowing, an unreliable narrator, and we figure out what's going on, but we see him blatantly rejecting mentally what he sees going on, or he just doesn't know. However, there is a caveat to this, and you can't just straight outright lie to your readers and expect nothing back. Now, the effect of an unreliable narrator is fantastic if you do it right. However, if your readers feel like they have been outright lied to with no possible way to figure out the truth behind the situation, then this will have a negative effect on your story. So this is one of the most important parts about writing an unreliable narrator. And I mentioned it with The Sixth Sense, and I didn't really mention it as much and I mentioned it with The Sixth Sense. So if you're going to lie to your readers, whether it's deliberate from the character or it's undeliberate because they're unwitting to what's going on, you, the author, still have to drop hints somehow, be them subtle or very loud, about what the truth of the situation is, so that when the reader goes through and finds out what the actual truth is, they can turn around and say, oh, I see all of the signs for that, and that totally makes sense. If at the end of the story, you say this character was married the whole time and you just didn't know, but there was never any indication whatsoever that they were hiding a marriage, then it just seems like it came out of nowhere. It seems fake, and it seems like you just forced it to go, ah ha ha ha, twist. I kind of talked about stuff like this with Beachhead. Yeah, because Beachhead just kept taking turns that didn't make sense for the storyline. Because it was like, and now I'm just really, really great at this, ah ha ha ha, or now I'm just going in this direction that was never actually planned for. And so it just seems like an author is making this choice for the sake of this choice, not that it makes sense within the storyline for the character. Does that make any sense? I hope it does. Just try not to lie and hide everything from your readers. Leave little tiny subtle hints. So now let's get into the different types of unreliable narrators that can be used. Number one is the deliberate unreliable character. So this is somebody who's going to go out specifically to lie to you. And they could be lying about themselves. They could be lying about their situation. They could be lying about others. Often, and they could be lying by omission too. They don't just have to be telling stuff about themselves, but they can just be not telling stuff about themselves. So imagine a main character who is like BTK or John Wayne Gacy, for that matter, because it's super easy to just imagine that they're both unreliable narrators of their own lives. And they will deliberately not mention some of the bad things that they did in order to get you on their side. Now, the way that you counteract that and you kind of show the disconnect. Imagine a character who is cheated on his wife and is hiding his infidelity. He might not bring up that he is cheating on his spouse. However, if we get the perspective of the spouse, then we might hear her mention his infidelity. And then we have to decide if she is also an unreliable character and would she lie about him and who do we trust. And so we have to kind of learn about these characters through the three ways that I learned how we learn about people. So in theater, we talk about this a lot. I mention it all the time. The three ways you learn about a person is through what they say about themselves, what others say about them, and what they do. And these three things do not have to be in alignment. They can all actually be disconnected. And depending on how much they connect or disconnect, it shows who is reliable, who is unreliable, who is trustworthy, who is not trustworthy. So you can imagine how making different lineups with those three things would change the perspective of the characters or whether somebody is reliable or not reliable. But again, if you're using a deliberate, unreliable narrator who is lying by omission or lying by saying they are much greater than they actually are, you have to show where they fail. And the deliberate, unreliable narrator could just be because they're a narcissist. Another type of unreliable narrator is the impaired narrator, and this use often comes about through alcohol, through drug use, through something that changes the mental state of the character. So they're not necessarily seeing things for how they should be or actually are. This is sort of self-explanatory because, if you're drunk and then you think that somebody is hitting on you when they're not, the easy way to know that you've got an impaired narrator is to see their alcoholism. And so then that will just tell the reader to not necessarily trust what this character sees or says because it might be slightly distorted. Another version of an unreliable narrator is the psychologically unreliable narrator. So this is going to be the type that Patrick Bateman is in American Psycho. So a psychological unreliable narrator it often takes the form of a narrator whose psychological issues or traumas or mental illnesses or mental breaks have jumbled up their memories or made it hard for them to understand the circumstances or events in which they are in. And I would say the narrator of my current work in progress, Canan Abel, is a psychologically unreliable narrator, as he sees everything around him happening through a filter of his brother. He doesn't see it as his own actions. He doesn't see himself acting in anything, and he has some weird visions. And one of the ways that the psychologically unreliable narrator helps is that if you're dealing with really harsh traumas or murder or something really, really dark, it adds a little bit of cushion because the character can't necessarily deal with it right on. There's like a level of psychotic break that they aren't dealing with it in the same manner that an emotionally connected person would. And it essentially gives the character who suffers nuance and characteristics outside of their issue, and the reader can kind of deal with the bad while they're learning about the character. There is also the unaware narrator, who it might be more common than we think about for unreliable narrators, and that's a character who was told information by another character, or even might be a child who doesn't know any better. So a friend of mine recently did a story where it was focused around children, and the children were talking about books and authors, and one of the characters, she wrote deliberately getting information incorrect about the authors because the character is like 7 or 9 or something. And so it's all of this heavy background information on this author or lore on this author of like super fans, and it might be incorrect within the story, or it might be incorrect within the universe, but this is what the character understands in the story. And so then the trick is trying to get people to understand that this is a 9-year-old who might not be correct. I would actually say an unaware narrator, especially with facts from real life, can be hard to get people to just buy in and accept, because people, if they know better, will look at the facts and then go, wait, that's wrong, and not realize that characters in books can actually be wrong. This can also end up looking like a situation where an author has lost continuity or they change their mind. So if the reader knows one thing about the story and a character says it and a character answers the opposite, so we know that it's wrong story-wise, it can be a really tricky place to convince the reader that this character just doesn't know better without, having hints in places that they just learned something different. And then there is the naive narrator. And the naive narrator is a little bit like the unaware narrator, but it doesn't have the maturity or thought to understand what's happening in the situation. Child characters can be used to make adult situations easier. I think of the novel The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is told from the perspective of an autistic young man, an autistic boy. And so we don't necessarily see the situation around him as accurately as it would be portrayed from an adult perspective. There's also situations where the naive, unreliable narrator might, through their youthful inexperience, misunderstand situations, might misunderstand information or commands because they just don't know any better, and then they'll go and do another thing. So what are some tips for writing unreliable characters? Now, I've already mentioned this a couple of times, so I'm going to save it really, really quickly in this group, is always drop breadcrumbs about what the truth is around the character, because regardless of what an unreliable character says about a situation, the consequences of the truth will always be there. There's a quote by Ayn Rand that was, "You can run from reality, but you can never run from the reality of the situation." So even if somebody is not acknowledging reality, even if somebody is hiding reality, even if somebody is deliberately lying about reality, the leftovers or signs of what is real in the world should actually still be there. And in the case of, say, Glamorama, there were replacements. There were replacements in the situation, so he didn't have to acknowledge that those were actual dead bodies. And we got to pick it up as it went along that this was not a movie set. If a guy says that a girl really, really wants to date him, is boasting to the reader about how popular he is with chicks, how any girl he walks up to wants to date him, and then he walks up to a girl and says, hey, you want to go out? And she goes, no. There's no avoiding that. And then he could go on into, if he's got an ego, he can go on into, she's intimidated, I'm just so attractive. And throughout the story, we can see how the unreliability comes out, how unreliable this character is, and how it shows. At the end of a story with an unreliable narrator, you don't have to flat out in a big way say what all was a lie and what all was fake. But if you drop hints and show the juxtaposition of the true and the false, readers will pick it up because readers are very smart. I trust you. I trust you, readers. The other really important thing to do when you're writing unreliable narrators, especially if they're not being deliberate unreliable narrators, is write them as if they're telling the truth. So with a naive narrator or a psychological narrator or any of those other narrators that are not necessarily the deliberate one, they would be saying what they think is true, even if we know better than that. And in the case where you're talking about the deliberate narrator, if they're being deliberate, unless they are very self-conscious or unsure about themselves, then even when they're telling a lie to mislead the reader, they would still be confident and go and act like this was the truth because they're trying to convince you of what the truth actually is. So always write your unreliable characters as if they're telling the truth and this is the obvious truth and it's as plain as saying 2 + 2 = 4 or the sky is blue or whatever truth exists. The power of an unreliable narrator is really brought to maximum impact if the reader is brought to believe this character and the story about them right up until the moment where it's revealed that you can't trust them or what the big twist is. So there are some stories that you can know from fairly early on, probably. I would even say maybe to 1/3. Does 1/3 count as early on? That they might not be reliable, but then you're wondering how much of what they're experiencing is or is not true. To keep as many details in the story as true as possible so that the lies don't seem as obvious. If the narrator is a frequent outright liar from the start of the novel, readers will put zero stock in the story at all. And honestly, this is off subject, but it's kind of on subject. This is why so many people hate "and then she woke up" style stories, because it feels like the whole book was a lie, or "and then they were pulled out of the simulation," because the whole thing was a lie. This is also why, part of the reason why, the starting your story with a dream sequence or with a false sequence also often bothers people, is because it's a false start. It doesn't directly impact the story usually, and it's kind of just there. It gives you a false idea of what the story is going to be about before cutting it off and then getting to the actual start of the story. So those are my thoughts on writing an unreliable narrator. Oh, let me say this. My final tip for writing unreliable characters is read other books that are written with unreliable characters, because one of the best things you can do for yourself as an author, especially if you're struggling with writing a certain thing, is find other people who have written that thing, either good or bad. Usually maybe a mixture of both if you can stomach it and find it, really, so that you can see what good portrayal looks like and what poor portrayal looks like, what good craft is and what bad craft is. So I've already given 2 recommendations. I mean, I know they're both Bret Easton Ellis, but again, he's one of my favorites. Another unreliable narrator book that I like is Fight Club. If you have any book suggestions for unreliable narrators, let me know in the comments down below. There are tons of them out there. Let me know if you are writing an unreliable narrator. Let me know if you want to talk about your story. And if you have any tips about writing this kind of thing, if you have any other tips for writing unreliable characters or things that you've run into when reading about them, I'd love to hear it. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. It helps me to know what you guys enjoy. If you have any subjects you'd like me to cover, mention them down below. And until next time, I think that's all that I have. So I will see you in the next video. Don't die. Bye-bye.